So, one of the things I kind of like is when Star Trek reaches out and actually does something just a little bit different. What I don't like is when Star Trek does something completely the same. That like something very predictable, in other words. Would you believe this episode is actually an example of both? First thing I want to talk about is something that I find very strange. This was talked about, I believe, in TV Guide at the time, which I'm sure some of my younger audience is probably asking, what's TV Guide? It was a magazine that came out right around, and was out in this time in history when Voyager was coming out, and previous to that, and was basically one of the more regular news media outlets that existed for fans of most TV shows. And they had some, quite a few things to do with Voyager, as far as marketing and campaign and whatnot, including the unusual marketing campaign snafus of UPN's approach. Remember the episode back in season 2, I want to say, Resistance or something like that? Yeah, that was one of their snafus that TV Guide commented on, as well as, shall we say, a rather derogatory commentary on Unity, the episode we just covered, which is funny because, again, I actually really like Unity, but I can see why those derogatory comments were made, and of course, we'll talk more about that when we get to the resultant of that issue, but we're not talking about that here. My point is, back in the day, there was this concept that actually apparently has continued forward. I noticed this was mentioned in, what's the name of that book? Beyond Space or something like that? There's a book that does its own little reviews, behind-the-scenes stuff, etc., on Star Trek in general and Voyager in particular, and they call it the Trilogy of Terror. I love this. I love this, given how many bad episodes there have been in Voyager, and we've covered quite a few of them, including Coda, which was very recent, and the horribleness that was Q in the Gray and Threshold, and Alliances. Now, the funny thing is, the first time I heard the term Trilogy of Terror, it didn't really click for me. It wasn't until I was reminded of it much, much later, about 3 or 4 years ago, I want to say, a fellow fan who was like talking about what do you think of the Trilogy of Terror? And my mind immediately leapt to Alliances, Q and the Gray, and Threshold, the 3 episodes I skipped. So I was like, and I started talking about them. And they were like, no, because they're referring to the Darkling, the episode you're talking about now, Rise, which is the next one, which is a Neelix and Tuvok episode, if you haven't seen it, and Favorite Son, which is a Harry Kim episode, for good and for bad. And it's weird because as soon as that was brought up, I remembered, that these were called the Trilogy of Terror back in the day, but I couldn't recall why. And I'm curious of your guys' opinion, honestly and sincerely. I know a lot of you, Flare Knight, and Flare Knight's one of the guys I see comment on a lot. I see Hunter comment on my stuff a lot. And I love reading your comments. I read them every time. I love having my regulars share on the series with me. I can't wait to do more series like Babylon 5 and Deep Space Nine and whatnot with you. But anyways, I digress. I'd love to hear your guys' comments on this because I don't remember these 3 episodes as being that bad. And then I rewatched. Now, all of this that I'm talking about right now was something I kind of prepared in my head to talk about before I even watched The Darkling. Then I watched The Darkling and I was like, that was a good episode. What the hell were these people laughing about? Now, again, opinions and preferences and all that fun stuff, but I liked The Darkling. It was an interesting way to stretch for the Doctor. And again, very cliched, very, very expected the way it was approached. It's like, oh, yeah, okay, so he's fiddling with his program, so he'll go evil, because that's what happens when you fiddle. And Kes is going to have a romance of the week, and he'll probably die, although the fact that he didn't die was kind of surprising, and so forth and so on. But again, it also did several things that subverted expectation. And the fact that he didn't die, I just gave that away, was a good one. But I digress. Let's move on. The original script for this episode was originally much, much, much darker. And it was toned down a lot. Michael Piller in specific said, no, pull that back down. And I found that interesting because it's one of those things. I am in favor of stretching in writing. I've talked about this before, with regard to macrocosm would be a great example of that. But there is such a thing as a line, and knowing where that line is actually really, really hard. There's no rules, there's no laws or set guideline you can follow. You just have to kind of have a feeling of experience and wisdom and having done this for long enough to say, okay, this is too much, let's pull it back a bit. This is especially true in television, but this is also true in movies and in video games and in books. There's a certain point at which it's like, okay, pull it back a bit. Don't care if it makes sense, just pull it back a bit. And the original thing, there was some horrible stuff in it. I mean, the evil doctor, I actually call him High Doctor. Hyde Doctor, yeah. The High Doctor. The Hyde Doctor. Hyde Doctor. There we go. We'll call him the Hyde Doctor. That's easier to say. The Hyde Doctor was doing some really messed up stuff. Very perverted, very sexually aggressive. One of the things, Kess was supposed to come onto the holodeck at one point, and there would be holographic representations of Kess all over the place in various states of disarray, dissected and pulled apart and rearranged, and just some horrible, horrible stuff. And the Doctor was going to have this casually flippant line of, "Oh, I'm just getting to know you better," because originally that's what they wanted, but they decided to pull it back because that would have crossed the line, and I agree. And here's the biggest reason why. I can say why in this case. Not just because of networks or censorship or anything like that, or not even just because this is Star Trek. Star Trek has never really shied away from being horrifying. Star Trek is usually more mentally horrifying than viscerally horrifying. I mean, the Borg, as awesome of an interesting villain race, etc., that they are pretty horrifying when you really think about it. And it gets more horrifying when you think about it, when you really start analyzing the Borg. But I digress. But the thing is, if they added that sort of sexual component to the relationship between the two, it would forever color any interaction between Kess and the Doctor from that point forward. Even if, logically, we could say that there is nothing there, it would be impossible for us as human beings, well, I shouldn't say impossible, it would be unlikely for us as human beings to get over that, to bypass the fact that this was the dirty old man thing. There's a saying in Hollywood that even if you can prove that you are innocent, it doesn't matter because the fact that you were accused changes public image of you, right? It's the same general concept. Once it's been introduced into your consciousness, it's a little harder to remove it. So they decided not to do that. And I'm going to talk about that basically at the end of here, but I think that was a very good choice on their part. This is probably among my favorite Kess episodes, in all honesty. It's an interesting insight into her. She's not perfect or goody-goody. She actually acts like a human, and in many ways acts like, if I can be blunt, a teenager. I don't mean that as an insult, though, not as stereotypical teenager. I mean someone who is emotionally unstable, someone who is still trying to get used to everything, someone who is still trying to figure out what she wants with her life. Maybe a young 20s person might be a little more accurate, because in my experience, people in college tended to act that way as well. But I digress. You get the idea. And it's a very interesting exploration of her haha irony, because it's all about her desire to explore. Kess has had many different hats. I shouldn't say it so derogatorily. She's had several different aspects of her personality that have been explored here and there throughout the series, but this one really touches on what I've always felt is Kess's strongest point, her desire to get out there and look and see. I've always felt that Kess was the one that convinced Neelix to join the Voyager crew. I've always felt that Kess is the one who convinced Neelix to stay on the Voyager crew after, incident A, B, or C happened. I've always felt that Kess is the one who really enjoys the journey far more than Neelix has, especially given Neelix's own issues. I talked about those back in Fair Trade. Neelix has always been trying to justify himself, hide, fearful, etc. Kess, I don't think, has ever been at that point. Kess has just been so wrapped up in the exploration and the journey and seeing what's out there. But in her own way, she has realized that Voyager itself is basically just another limitation, another habitat. Even though it is a moving one, and she is exploring, she isn't actually exploring, if you follow me. And I know that sounds weird, and I'm going to fail at describing this, but the idea here is that if you're doing something consistently, that isn't variance. even if you're doing it mobilely, right? For example, if you every day decided to wear a different color shirt, that is then a constant, not a variable. You understand? Because every day you're changing your shirt. So the new constant is what you were trying to do to vary it up. It's one of the things that's very difficult to do in writing and in entertainment in general with regards to design, is trying to be different and therefore ending up being more the same when you're trying to do it. So, getting back to Kes here, though, for Kes, I feel like, Voyager has become the norm for her, even though it is, exploring in the strictest sense of the word. She wants to explore. She wants to go out there and try new things and get hurt and bruise her shins, so to speak. As I used to give the speech to fledgling parents, and indeed was given this speech myself by my mom. There's a point in time where you want to get out there and you want to bruise your knees, or bruise your shins and scuff your knees and get dirty. You want to experience it for yourself. You want to do that so you can grow and learn and understand, and then you can figure out what you want to do and do with it, right? So there's a very strong emphasis of that throughout Kiss's performance in this one, and she does make some mistakes, and she does get a little uppity, but then she does a little bit defensive, but then she does get understanding, and then it's all very well played out. And it's funny because this really isn't the Doctor episode in any real strength of the word, unless you count the fact that the Doctor is trying to improve himself, which he's been doing for a long time now, as the main plot, which it is obviously not. The main plot really is about Kes. Of course, the hidden thing in the title, obviously the Darkling is referring to, the Doctor. That's his official other name, the Darkling. I called him the High Doctor, but the Darkling is what he's supposed to be called. But the Darkling's other thing is it refers to that idea of what Kes is doing, the fact that she has been attempting to grow and nourish and enter the light, so to speak, and has basically never been given the chance to in any realistic fashion until now. But I digress. Let's go ahead and move on to... Speaking of the whole explorative thing, okay, I like the cultural concept of an entire species that is designed around traveling. The idea of constantly being on the move, constantly exploring, the near total lack of caring, of one's own safety, constant risk-taking, that kind of a thing. It's one of those fascinating cultural perspectives. Even though it has a problem, I'll talk about the problem in a moment. But for example, the right of transit. That's not what they call it. They don't actually call it anything. But I will go where I please, when I please, how I please. Do you dispute this right? That one line was great because it's all you need. This is great writing tip for anyone who's curious. Had something tiny little that's just a peek, a window into some kind of right or some kind of legal precedence or strength or what a cultural significance, so that we as the audience can then extrapolate on that and be like, oh, and it's immediately apparent. We get it immediately, but there's so much we can think about when it comes to that too. We can understand and expound upon the possibilities of a society built around those precepts, etc., etc. Pretty simple stuff. But interesting. But then it does kind of fall flat a little bit because, well, I don't want to talk about the hats concept too much here. I'm saving that talk for when the Herosians show up. And I do intend to talk about it, trust me. But there's this concept called the Planet of Hats. It's the idea that everyone within a certain species has the same hat, which is, of course, a metaphor for the fact that they all have the same general concept behind them. It's a very common thing in general, not just in science fiction, but in fiction, in speculative fiction in general. But it is probably most prevalent and most obvious in Star Trek, because, with few exceptions, just about all of insert race here are insert categorization here. Now, I don't want to get too much into that discussion, but there is no denying that I don't even remember their names in this episode, are very much a hat. Their hat is traveling. Yeah, this is what we do, and this is all we do, and everything about their society and everything about their concept and ideology is all about traveling. Sci-Fi Debris once made a comparison to how this would be like in real life, and I actually liked it enough that I am borrowing it and giving him credit. The idea here that if Germany was a Star Trek thing, they would all be about war, and they would all be efficient, and they would all be dedicated towards the concept of conquest and all that fun stuff. And there would be no room for any of the variety or wonderful, the philosophers and the scientists and the artists that exist in German society, because that's not their hat, right? But I digress. I don't want to get too much into that discussion, even though I've already gotten too much into it. Let's move on. One of the things that I do like about this episode is the idea of a sentient being able to reprogram itself. I've already made my point, or my opinion, very clear, that I believe the Doctor is sentient. The fact that he can just reprogram himself is kind of terrifying. And there's a quote of mine, not a quote of mine, but there's a quote that I love that's basically, if the mind were so simple we could understand it... Wait, hang on. How's that go? Shoot. If the mind... I don't remember. The idea is, if the mind was understandable, we would be so simple as to not understand it. In other words, we don't know how the mind works. We don't know how personalities and perspectives work. We have the most absolute bare outside edges of understanding of how a being works, of how sentience works, and all that fun stuff. And so... And of course, these things are debated incessantly because we don't know, and because there are differing perspectives, which is a kind of an ironic little loop there, if you think about it. But the point being, it's pretty obvious when you go tinkering with something that sophisticated and that complicated that there are going to be consequences. In fact, it has been argued that one of the reasons this episode is a bad episode is because what the Doctor did was stupid. And it is. I'm not even going to argue that. What the Doctor did is retarded. He should be sufficiently intelligent to recognize that meddling with something that complex without any level of understanding of what he's doing, really. I mean, it can be debated. It can be argued with. But the thing I want to get on is the fascinating concept of what that would entail. Now, obviously, it's going to go bad. Yeah, we all got that from the moment he started doing it. But what would you think if you could reprogram yourself, if you could alter yourself in some way, if you could just be like, and there's a new you that comes out of that? Wouldn't that be interesting and, if I can be blunt, a little horrifying? Because keep in mind, what he was doing was not reprogramming himself directly. He was basically grafting subroutines into and on his own. So imagine if you suddenly could do the same kind of thing. If you could just say, well, I want Albert Einstein's general subroutines grafted onto mine, or I want insert person here. It doesn't matter. Lord knows how that would actually come to being. And it's not like you could just go in and say, well, I want to get rid of my arachnophobia. It doesn't work that way, right? In fact, it could probably make several neuroses a lot worse. But I digress. One of the things that I like is the idea here, which I'll go ahead and tell you now, my rewrite, so to speak. The only thing I would do is I would have Kes leave in this episode. I know that sounds weird, because I like Kes as a character, but I would keep her on as a recurring character, which has its own little rules and regs as far as appearances and salary and all that fun stuff as far as behind the scenes. But bring her back every now and again as someone who is an explorer, as someone who is learning and growing, and each time we'll see another window and we'll hear some of her tales, and she'll be involved in whatever's going on that week, and that's kind of it, really. Have her actually develop her and explore her life until it gets to the point where she actually has the chance to go to the Alpha Quadrant. And if I'm blunt, I would go ahead and have some way that would be developed with access to the Alpha Quadrant's much greater medical resources, that they would have some way to go ahead and elongate her lifespan, which would then be the conclusion of her character arc, basically. In other words, if you're understanding, it would be the beginning of her next character arc, as, now I've got the Alpha and Beta Quadrants to explore. Oh my gosh, this is great. And I get to explore it with my friends, which is even better. A very satisfying ending for her, and one that I would have her work for. I would have her scarred over the course of the years as she's flitting back and forth and barely surviving. In some cases, I would have her rescued by the crew. But that's just my idea, and of course I can only speak in generalizations because I don't have the document in front of me where I wrote all that stuff down, but you get the idea. I also really, really like the scene between Kes and Janeway. Mulgrew's performance was pretty much spot on. It was someone who was very clearly cared. It was actually rather maternal in the way that she wanted what's best for Kes, but didn't want to hurt her, but didn't want her to leave, obviously wanted her to stay, but ultimately knew that this was a big decision for her. And actually, it did seem a lot like an awesome scene between a daughter and her mother. Which is funny, because if you think about it, Janeway is basically the closest thing to a mother Kes has ever really had. And so it makes a lot of sense that she would actually approach her like that, and that Janeway would so naturally fall into that is interesting to me. Because Janeway has always been a very distant and more... well, as I've said before, she's not really the captain. She doesn't have that close thing. You know, I've talked about this before. The fact that she slid into it with Kes, though, kind of makes a degree of sense to me, because there's always been that little degree of connection between the two. After all, she did go through a lot for her back in the religious episode, whose name I can't think of. But I digress. There were a lot of little details in the Darkling's appearance. I'll just start calling him that. It's easier to say. That I didn't really notice... obviously on my first few viewings. When I watched it for this video, it was actually a lot more apparent, but then again, I went in knowing. He's got... Robert Picardo has contacts in, so his eyes dilate a little bit, and so his pupils look like a little more beady, and he's got this dental prosthetic in that makes it so that his jaw here juts out just a little bit more than it would. And they did a little bit different stuff with his makeup to highlight some of the areas. All very quiet, subtle stuff, but it was a really nice change because it really helped change his appearance to accent, to complement. There we go. That's what I'm going to complement his performance. For those of you who don't know, Robert Picardo has basically played this kind of character before in a werewolf thing, and he's actually played Hyde before in the theaters. So he was actually well versed in the idea of playing, you know, the Jekyll and Hyde archetype, and he does a really, really good job of it. If I can be blunt, Picardo basically sells the role, especially since he's not... Well, I've always felt like the Darkling as a character is an individual that I almost would have liked to see more of and more development, because he was certainly not a good person, and he was certainly deranged, but I hesitate to call him evil. It's more along the lines of the fact that he is very unstable and very vulnerable, and the way he's constantly presented is constantly trying to hide the fact that he's vulnerable, fighting back, lashing out, using violence to catch people's attention. Everything he does is basically to distract others from his own weaknesses, and it's fascinating the way he presents it, and Picardo does a great job acting it, of course. There's also a line, I just gotta share this, for some of you might like this. There's a line he says where darkness is more fundamental than light. And he keeps going, but the way he said that, I was just like, oh my god, he's turned into a Heartless. I'm just waiting for the Seeker of Darkness to show up behind him and start... Yeah, no. I also... Okay, so I said I'd talk about this later. It is interesting that the writing and acting was very specifically designed, as I mentioned earlier, so there's no sexual connection between Kes and the Doctor, or Kes and the Darkling. At no point does he come on to her or approach her in an aggressive manner or in a sensual manner. He does with Taurus, if you remember. And in fact, Roxanne Dawson and Picardo apparently had a lot of fun and were having trouble keeping a straight face because of how silly the whole thing came across as. More than once. But regardless, they deliberately removed that. And I feel like this is the other reason I mentioned this earlier. I feel like this was for the strength of the episode, because it shows an interesting side of the Darkling that, of course, was never and will never be followed through on. I don't think I would go so far as to say he was acting parentally towards her. Well, I'll talk about that in a moment. But he was definitely acting in a very possessive manner of her. A very, you know, you are mine and I know what's best for you, so do what I say, damn it, kind of a thing. Which isn't right or wrong or anything so black and white. It's just this wonderful mishmash of personality and characterization, which is why I liked it. But I said I'd talk about the parental thing. He does come across very much as the overprotective father in several ways. And I don't mean this obviously, because I've actually talked about this to several people and they didn't even catch this. The overall theme of this episode is definitely growing up. You know, leaving the nest, if you want to put it into such terms. And Janeway's approach is very much the one type of parent. And I'm going to leave genders out of this because genders don't actually matter when it comes to this kind of thing. Some parents, when their children want to leave the nest, they're nervous, they're excited, they're kind of scared and worried about them, and they don't want to lose their child, but they understand that they want to get out there and see new things, so they support them, and they cry when they go, and they're sad, but they're happy, right? I'm sure at least some of you out there know what I'm talking about. Some other type of parents get really scared, basically. And that's why I use that term possessive. Protective is another way to put that. You don't know what it's like out there. You don't know how bad it can be. I went through all this horrible stuff. I don't want you to go through all this horrible stuff. And it's an interesting lens because Janeway's is presented pretty much flat. But if you think about it, ultimately, Janeway, again, this is why I brought this up earlier, is she's a distant person. Why would she be acting as the mother figure? The reason why in this case is more thematic than literal. In other words, Janeway is actually the far end of this side of the spectrum. She is the furthest extent of all those feelings, of all those types of, I'm nervous and excited and etc., right? Whereas the Darkling is the furthest extreme of the possessive things, the literally willing to resist and disallow the person from actually leaving the nest and trying to protect them and telling them, you have to go with me and you have to do what I say and I'll protect you and I'll take care of you, blah, blah, blah. Now, obviously, this is not a perfect analogy because it shouldn't be. Symbolism shouldn't be that one-to-one. But that underlying theme really helps flesh it out, especially since, if you think about it, as I mentioned earlier, Janeway is effectively the closest thing to Kes has had as a mother, and the Doctor is effectively the closest thing that she's ever had to a father. And I have no doubt that that started from her end, from Kes's end. Because if you remember, when Kes and the Doctor first started interacting, the Doctor was still fairly basic and fundamental in his personality. The ego and arrogance, but that came from Zimmerman. The Doctor's personality didn't really start to fully flesh itself out until, midway through Season 1 or by Season 2, depending on how you define it. And by that point in time, he started actually becoming more of an individual, by which, partially thanks to Kes's help, but Kes, who wanted a parental figure in her life, who wanted a father figure, probably basically pushed, this is of course my theory, pushed that concept onto him, which in turn helped him to kind of grow to the occasion, so to speak, which, again, is one of the reasons why I feel like this episode, it would be best, thematically, for Kes to leave in this episode, to actually leave the nest, which she does not, if you're paying attention. In fact, she basically never does. She gets written out of the show for reasons that we still to this day don't actually understand, but I'll get to that later. Two more things to talk about real quick. Number one, the oath at the end was awesome. Him actually reciting the Hippocratic Oath was pretty sweet. Not much else to add to that, but that is very, very much the Doctor, and it really, really was indicative of his personality. So that's all I want to say on that one. But the other thing I want to talk about is... I don't need my notes for this. I have heard the, good is better than evil, or good is more correct than evil argument a few trillion times in real life and in fiction. Slight exaggeration on the number, but the point remains. I've heard it a lot. You have too, I'm sure. If you've watched or read or played or whatever, just about anything, you have heard the good is better than evil speech. I think this is one of the very first times that I've heard it said in such an interesting way. Kes gives the perspective that the organs in someone's body have to coordinate, have to cooperate, have to have some symbiotic relationship with each other, or else they will die. And she uses that as a building block to make her statement. And she's making the same argument that's been made a billion times. Good is more natural, is more correct, is more proper than evil, right? But the way she starts that and builds that argument really caught my attention. I actually rewound and watched the scene again because it's a fascinating starting point. The idea that cooperation is necessary to basic fundamental survival is fairly true when you think about it. I mean, Darwinism is its own thing, and survival of the fittest is its own thing, but ultimately it comes down to the ability to function in a group unit. Let's be honest with ourselves, one of the primary reasons that human beings are the dominant force on this planet, but despite our many flaws, is because we work together. We still do. I mean, obviously there's a lot of internecine conflict as well, but the point remains. We still cohabitate way more than we do the opposite. So, yeah. And then she started building on that, as I kind of just did, into social cooperation, into societal cooperation, into cultural cooperation. And the idea that the whole thing is obviously different and contrasting and obviously has issues with itself and doesn't always agree with itself, but it is still unified. You know, it's something I've said is pretty awesome for quite some time, all the way back to the Mass Effect thing, and obviously before that, since I've been saying this since I was 11. But the point remains, it was a great way to build that argument, and it really, I feel, was the final insight into Kess as a character, which is another reason why she should have just left after that arc was completed, and we could start her second arc, because I think the way it was presented, the way she said it, and the way the lines were written, that what she was saying was not just, her trying to convince the Darkling. I think she really believed it. I think that was truly, fundamentally her core belief system. And I know that sounds weird because, most people associate a belief with some kind of religiousness or whatever, but that's not relevant. A belief, a real belief, is something that is utterly and completely core to you. No one else. It is something that is you. And it's one of those things that can't really be changed or altered or broken because it is your belief. It is the corest part of you, right? And I felt like that was what it was for her and her perspective on things and her ideology. In fact, this is another example of my definition of the Worf effect here. I find myself amused because she strikes me as an idealized federation of the ideals that Roddenberry himself pushed out as being, this is what... Well, okay, I don't want to get too much into the Roddenberry thing again, but the idea being, the human ideal of Star Trek and the tolerance and understanding because of our differences, despite our differences, not because we're all the same, which is why I have to leave Roddenberry out of this. And I like that. I like her presentation of that kind of perspective, of being a true example of the Federation, which is another reason, this is like my fifth reason now, that I think it would be great if she left Voyager at this point in time. Not the show, the ship. Because then she could go out and actually be an example of that idea, of that philosophy, of that cooperation thing. And it would burn her sometimes, but it is her belief. So that wouldn't shake her belief. It would just make her keep going and make her have to adapt and work around the conflicts and difficulties in her way. And I just think that would be awesome. But I have not more to say, so I will see you at the next of the episode of the Trilogy of Terror!
You're wrong.
How so?
Empathy and kindness are basic to all forms of life. You have access to the doctor's medical knowledge. You know what he does.
Yes.
Then you know what I'm saying is true. The very organs and cells of the body cooperate with each other. Otherwise, they wouldn't function.